It was a cold January morning in Hutchinson, Kansas, and the day began like any other in this quiet prairie town of 40,000 residents nestled along the Arkansas River. People woke to temperatures hovering around freezing, bundled up for work, started their cars to warm in driveways, dropped children at school. The sun rose over flat Kansas farmland, stretching in every direction. Hutchinson, known locally as Salt City because of vast underground salt deposits, seemed utterly ordinary that Thursday morning of January 17, 2001. What residents didn't know as they went about their routines was that beneath their feet, 7 miles of underground passages were filled with millions of cubic feet of natural gas that had been leaking silently for 3 days, while technicians at a storage facility dismissed pressure drops as routine fluctuations. Within hours, their downtown would explode violently, geysers would erupt throughout the city, 6 people would die, and their small Kansas town would become the site of one of America's most unusual industrial disasters. Hutchinson's identity was deeply tied to salt discovered in the 1880s when prospectors searching for oil instead found massive underground deposits at depths of 400 to 800 feet. This transformed Hutchinson into a major salt production center. Mining companies used solution mining, drilling wells into salt formations, pumping fresh water down to dissolve the salt, then pumping the resulting brine back up where salt was extracted through evaporation. The process was efficient but created vast underground caverns where solid salt had once been, hollowed chambers hundreds of feet across. As decades passed and operations expanded, moved or closed, many wells were simply abandoned. Some were sealed with concrete plugs, others were sealed poorly or not at all. By the late 20th century, hundreds of abandoned wells dotted the area, most forgotten, their precise locations lost as companies changed hands or disappeared. The underground caverns found new purpose as storage facilities. Their size, stability, and natural insulation made them ideal for long-term storage. Hollywood studios kept master copies of classic films in climate-controlled underground vaults, preserved in darkness where temperature remained constant and no flood or tornado could reach them. But other companies saw potential for storing liquefied petroleum gas and natural gas in those caverns. The Yaggy Storage Field, 7 miles northwest of downtown, began operations in the 1980s, when a company converted old salt caverns to store propane. The caverns sat roughly 650 feet deep, accessed through steel-lined wells. Propane was pumped down into caverns where it stayed under pressure in naturally sealed chambers. The system worked until financial difficulties hit in the late 1980s. Before shutting down, they sealed wells by drilling out steel casing to a certain depth, filling that section with concrete to prevent gas escaping. The facility sat dormant for years. In the early 1990s, Kansas Gas Service purchased Yaggy and reopened it. Natural gas demand fluctuated seasonally, peaking in winter for heating. Having storage capacity meant purchasing gas during cheap summer months, storing it underground, then drawing on reserves during expensive winter rather than paying premium prices. Yaggy caverns could store billions of cubic feet, enough to supply tens of thousands of homes through winter. But reopening required removing the concrete plugs sealing the wells. Drilling out concrete within steel casing required precision to avoid damaging the steel. If the drill bit wandered or hit an obstruction, it could tear or puncture the casing, creating a leak point. During reopening of well Seb 1, something went wrong. The bit encountered what was described as a piece of metal, possibly a remnant from original construction or sealing. The bit caught on this metal and tore into the steel casing itself. A geological consultant who later reviewed video footage described the damage as looking like a kitchen knife cutting into a tin can, a jagged tear creating an opening for gas to escape. This damage occurred during drilling in the early 1990s, but nobody noticed it. For years after Yaggy reopened, it operated without obvious problems. Gas was pumped in during summer and withdrawn during winter. The facility expanded, adding caverns and increasing capacity. By 2001, Yaggy could hold enough gas to heat approximately 50,000 homes for a year, making it critical infrastructure for regional supply. Trained technicians monitored pressure levels, gas flow rates, and operational parameters. Everything seemed normal. On January 14, 2001, 3 days before the explosion, technicians noticed something during routine monitoring. Well Seb 1 showed a pressure drop. The cavern had been refilled recently, pumped full of gas to near capacity, but pressure was lower than expected. This could indicate cooling gas, which is normal, or a leak, which is catastrophic. The critical question was determining which. The technicians made a decision with catastrophic consequences. They classified the pressure drop as routine, attributing it to gas cooling. Their reasoning seemed sound. They had just pumped large quantities of gas in, and newly injected gas would cool and show pressure reduction. This happened regularly. They noted the pressure drop in logs but didn't investigate further. They didn't conduct tests to verify their hypothesis. They didn't inspect the well, they didn't slow or stop gas injection. Instead, they continued normal operations, which meant continuing to pump more gas. Over January 15 and 16, technicians pumped approximately 80 million cubic feet of additional gas into Yaggy storage. This is enormous quantity, equivalent to 12 large commercial gas tankers. All the while, pressure readings continued showing concerning patterns. Rather than stabilizing as it would if cooling were the only factor, pressure kept dropping. Continuous pressure decline despite ongoing gas injection is textbook sign of a leak, but technicians, having decided the issue was routine cooling, continued with that interpretation. They kept pumping gas, essentially feeding the leak, making the situation worse each passing hour. Meanwhile, 7 miles away in downtown Hutchinson, nobody knew millions of cubic feet of gas were escaping underground and migrating toward the city. Natural gas is primarily methane, lighter than air. Released at surface, it rises and disperses quickly. But gas leaking deep underground behaves differently. Rock formations have varying permeability. Some layers are dense and impermeable, sealing gas below, others are porous or fractured, allowing gas to migrate. The geology beneath Hutchinson consisted of multiple sedimentary rock layers, limestone, sandstone, shale, laid down over millions of years with different properties. When pressurized gas began escaping from damaged well Seb1 at Yaggy, it didn't rise straight up. Instead, it followed the path of least resistance through underground geology. Escaping gas initially moved upward from the deep cavern toward shallower rock layers, driven by natural buoyancy and pressure differential. As it rose, it encountered a relatively permeable layer at shallower depth, probably 400 to 500 feet. This layer acted like an underground highway, allowing gas to spread horizontally in all directions from the leak point. Gas migrated through this permeable layer, moving outward from Yaggy in a slowly expanding plume. Migration rate was probably a few hundred feet to perhaps a quarter mile per day. Over 3 days, gas could easily travel several miles underground, and critically, the gas plume was moving toward Hutchinson. As gas spread through the permeable underground layer, it encountered abandoned brine wells that dotted the area. These old wells, drilled decades earlier for salt mining then abandoned, created vertical pathways from the deep permeable layer where gas was migrating up to the surface. Some had proper concrete seals blocking gas movement. Others had inadequate seals or none at all, just open holes extending hundreds of feet deep to the surface. When the expanding gas plume reached these abandoned wells, gas had an easy pathway upward. It would rise through the well propelled by buoyancy, accumulating at the top near surface. If the well opened to atmosphere, gas would vent harmlessly. But if the well terminated in a basement, or was covered by buildings or pavement, gas would accumulate in confined space. Confined natural gas mixed with air creates explosive mixture. Any ignition source could trigger explosion. The morning of January 17, 2001 began normally downtown. Businesses opened around 9 or 10 a.m. The Dico shop, a furniture store, opened its doors. Woody's appliance store prepared for the day. These stores occupied older buildings, multi-story brick structures built decades earlier. Like many older commercial buildings, they had basements for storage or utilities. And like many buildings in Hutchinson, they sat on or near abandoned brine wells whose precise locations had been forgotten. Gas that had been migrating underground for 3 days had reached abandoned wells beneath downtown businesses. The gas rose through wells and began accumulating in basements and crawl spaces. The accumulation was invisible and odorless. Natural gas in pure form has no smell. The distinctive rotten egg odor comes from mercaptan, and additive utilities add to gas in distribution pipelines so people can detect leaks. But gas leaking from Yaggy hadn't gone through any processing. It was raw natural gas coming directly from underground storage, completely odorless. People working in buildings had no warning that explosive concentrations were building beneath their feet. At approximately 10:45 a.m., something created a spark in the decor shop basement. It might have been a light switch, A motor starting, electrical equipment cycling on, any of hundreds of potential ignition sources in a commercial building. The concentrated gas-air mixture exploded instantly. The explosion was devastating. The force blew out windows, shattered the building's facade, sent debris flying across the street. The blast destroyed approximately half a city block of commercial structures. Glass rained down on sidewalks, brick and concrete fragments scattered across intersections. People on the street were knocked down by the shockwave. Within seconds, the decor shop was a burning ruin, flames pouring from shattered windows, smoke rising into the cold January sky. Emergency calls flooded the fire department immediately. Fire trucks and ambulances arrived within minutes to find scenes of devastation. The decor shop was completely destroyed. Adjacent buildings showed blast damage, debris-covered streets. Miraculously, casualties were relatively light. Several people had been in or near the shop, but most were outside the immediate blast radius. Injuries ranged from cuts from flying glass to trauma from being thrown by blast wave, but by extraordinary luck, nobody in immediate vicinity died. Firefighters initially assumed a standard building explosion, probably from a broken gas line. They established a perimeter, began evacuating nearby buildings, and started fighting the fire. Following standard protocol, they contacted Kansas Gas Service to shut off gas supply. Utility workers arrived and shut down distribution lines serving that section of downtown. But even with gas lines shut off, the fire continued burning with intensity, suggesting a large fuel source. Firefighters realized with growing concern they weren't dealing with a standard gas line break. Gas feeding this fire was coming from somewhere else, somewhere they couldn't control. Just moments after the first explosion, before firefighters had fully assessed the situation, a second explosion rocked Woody's appliance store a short distance away. This blast followed the same pattern. Gas accumulated in confined space, found ignition source, detonated. The explosion destroyed the appliance store and damaged surrounding structures. Now firefighters dealt with multiple explosion sites, multiple fires, and a horrifying realization that whatever was causing explosions was not under control. More fire companies were called from surrounding communities. Police established wider perimeters and began evacuating more buildings. As emergency responders fought fires and searched damaged buildings, the situation took a stranger turn. Late afternoon, with fires still burning, people reported something extraordinary on the east side of Hutchinson, miles from downtown explosion sites. Gases were erupting from the ground. Columns of gas and water were shooting 20 to 30 feet into the air from multiple locations. The gases consisted of natural gas mixed with saltwater brine. Some had ignited, creating pillars of flame rising from the ground. The gases appeared primarily in residential neighborhoods and vacant lots on the east side, completely separate from downtown. City officials, already overwhelmed by downtown explosions, now faced crises happening simultaneously across multiple parts of the city. Emergency meetings were convened. Experts were called. Nobody had seen anything like this. The pattern made no sense. Why would explosions occur downtown then hours later gases erupt miles away? What connected these events? The answer lay underground, in the network of abandoned wells and permeable rock layers, but it would take days to piece together. Contractors and geologists began emergency investigations to trace gases to their sources. They quickly determined gases were erupting from old brine wells, some inactive for 50 or 60 years. These wells had been drilled during height of salt mining, then abandoned when mines closed. Many had never been properly sealed. Over decades, they'd been forgotten, built over or lost track of as land changed ownership. Now natural gas rising through forgotten wells was bringing up brine from deep salt formations and erupting at surface. The investigation took a crucial turn when officials contacted Yaggy Storage Facility. Had they noticed anything unusual, any operational problems? Technicians reviewed their logs and discovered something horrifying. Well one had shown a pressure drop 3 days earlier. More significantly, on the morning of January 17, approximately 15 minutes after the first explosion downtown, they noticed a dramatic sudden pressure drop in well C1, so severe it indicated massive gas loss. Looking back at pressure records for preceding days, they realized with terrible clarity that well C1 had been leaking not for hours but for at least 3 full days. The minor pressure drop they dismissed as routine on January 14 was actually the beginning of catastrophic leak. Over those 3 days, while they continued pumping more gas, approximately 143 million cubic feet of natural gas had escaped underground, migrating 7 miles through permeable rock to emerge beneath Hutchinson. The realization sent shockwaves through emergency response. The gas source was not something local that could be shut off quickly. It was an active leak from a massive storage facility 7 miles away, and gas had created an underground plume connecting Yaggy to Hutchinson through natural geological features and man-made abandoned wells. Shutting down the leak at Yaggy would stop new gas entering the system, but 143 million cubic feet was already distributed through 7 miles of underground rock and hundreds of abandoned wells. That gas would continue emerging at surface for weeks or months. The following day, January 18th, brought the disaster's deadliest moment. Gas had been seeping into a mobile home park on the east side, entering trailer homes through gaps and accumulating underneath structures. Mobile homes have skirting around their base for insulation, but this also created enclosed space that trapped accumulating gas. In one trailer occupied by an elderly couple, gas had built to explosive concentration overnight. In the morning, when someone started cooking, probably igniting a stove burner, the gas detonated. The explosion completely destroyed the mobile home and killed both residents instantly. Their deaths brought the tragedy into sharp focus. This wasn't just property damage. People were dying because of gas that had been leaking for days, while storage facility technicians dismissed pressure warnings as minor issues. By evening on January 18th, Hutchinson was in full crisis mode. Downtown was still burning and partially destroyed. Multiple gases continued erupting across the city. 2 people were dead, with more deaths feared. Emergency managers made the decision to evacuate. Nearly 200 homes and 40 businesses received evacuation orders. Residents fled with minimal belongings, uncertain when they could return. The evacuation was complicated by ground conditions. Gas intrusion and brine weight coming through abandoned wells had created sinkholes throughout the city, areas where ground had collapsed into underground voids. Streets were damaged or blocked. Railroad traffic through Hutchinson was completely halted. Officials feared train vibration could trigger gas explosions or cause additional ground collapses. The shutdown disrupted freight rail service across Kansas and beyond. Every hour brought new uncertainties and fears. Where would the next explosion occur? How much gas was still underground? How long would this continue? The psychological toll on residents was immense. The ground beneath their city had become an enemy, an invisible threat that could erupt anywhere. The Kansas Geological Survey conducted comprehensive studies. Survey teams collected soil samples throughout affected areas, measuring gas concentrations and trying to map contamination extent. They used sophisticated equipment, including thermal imaging cameras, that could detect heat signatures from escaping gas, ground-penetrating radar to map underground structures and voids, and seismic equipment to study rock layers. One innovative technique involved thumper trucks with vibrating plates that sent seismic waves into the ground, measuring how waves reflected off different rock layers, creating an ultrasound-like image of underground geology. NASA was contacted and asked to deploy aerial surveillance capabilities. NASA dispatched aircraft equipped with thermal imaging systems that could detect temperature differences of fractions of a degree from thousands of feet up, identifying gas leaks by cooling effect as gas expanded and escaped. NASA conducted multiple aerial surveys over Hutchinson and surrounding region, creating detailed thermal maps showing hotspots where gas was actively leaking. Additionally, NASA used radar systems from aircraft and satellites to monitor ground deformation. When large volumes of gas escape underground, rock above can settle or shift. Radar measurements could detect these changes and identify areas where ground was sinking or where sinkholes might develop. The findings were both enlightening and alarming. Gas had spread through underground formations across several square miles. The migration pattern was complex, following fractures and permeable zones connecting Yaggy to downtown and beyond. Abandoned wells provided vertical conduits from deep permeable zones to surface, but not all wells were equally active. Some had partial seals restricting gas flow. Others were wide open and venting large volumes. The pressing question was what to do about escaping gas. Simply waiting for it to vent naturally would take months and posed ongoing explosion risks. The solution was to drill new wells at strategic locations along the gas migration path and use these wells to provide controlled venting where gas could be brought to surface and safely burned off. This would be much safer than allowing gas to emerge randomly through abandoned wells in people's basements. Work began immediately on a drilling program. Engineering teams identified locations where new vent wells should be placed based on geological survey data and NASA's thermal imaging. Drilling crews worked around the clock, sinking new wells 400 to 600 feet deep at multiple points across affected area. Each well was equipped with piping to bring gas to surface in controlled manner. At surface, gas was ignited using flare systems, large controlled burns converting methane to carbon dioxide and water vapor. The flares created dramatic scenes, pillars of flame rising from well sites throughout Hutchinson, burning continuously day and night. The flaring operation continued for more than a month. 143 million cubic feet of gas had to be burned off, and burn rate depended on how quickly gas could be safely brought to surface through vent wells without creating dangerous pressure buildups. Fire departments maintained constant presence at flare sites, monitoring burns and ensuring they remained controlled. The flames were visible for miles, creating an eerie nighttime glow over Hutchinson that persisted for weeks. Environmental concerns mounted. Burning 143 million cubic feet of methane released substantial carbon dioxide, though this was preferable to letting methane escape unburned since methane is a far more potent greenhouse gas. More immediately concerning was contamination of soil and groundwater throughout affected area. Natural gas had been percolating through soil for days, and firefighting operations had dumped thousands of gallons of water containing chemicals into ground at explosion sites. Soil samples showed petroleum contamination in many areas. Groundwater wells tested positive for methane and various hydrocarbons. Air quality was another major concern. While flaring burned gas in controlled manner, combustion still released pollutants including particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, and incompletely combusted hydrocarbons. Residents complained of respiratory irritation, headaches, and nausea. Air quality monitoring stations tracked pollutant levels. When measurements exceeded safe thresholds, warnings recommended vulnerable populations stay indoors. Air quality problems persisted for weeks. For people whose businesses were destroyed, the disaster created immediate financial catastrophe. The initial explosion had completely gutted 2 businesses and caused varying degrees of damage to 26 others. Store owners arrived to find nothing but rubble where their livelihoods had existed hours earlier. Inventory was destroyed. Equipment was destroyed. Buildings were destroyed or damaged beyond economical repair. Many discovered insurance policies didn't adequately cover disaster scenarios like this. Standard commercial insurance might cover fire, but not necessarily explosions caused by underground gas migration from a storage facility 7 miles away. The explosion destroyed more than physical structures. It destroyed the economic heart of a small town depending on local businesses. The Dicker shop had been a downtown fixture for decades, a family-owned business serving generations of Hutchinson residents. When these businesses didn't reopen, it left permanent scars. The destroyed buildings were never rebuilt. The lots became vacant spaces in what had been continuous commercial streetscape, visual reminders of disaster visible to anyone driving through downtown. The mobile home park where the elderly couple died was closed permanently. The entire park was deemed unsafe for habitation given its location over multiple abandoned wells through which gas had emerged. The approximately 50 families living in the park had to find new housing, many with limited financial resources. The park closure added to displacement toll, pushing the total permanently displaced into hundreds. As flaring operations continued and immediate crisis slowly came under control, attention turned to accountability. Lawsuits were filed almost immediately. Business owners filed against Kansas Gas Service, its parent company One Oak Incorporated, and subsidiaries, alleging negligence in maintaining Yaggy and responding to pressure drops. They sought compensation not just for destroyed property but for lost income. A class action lawsuit organized hundreds of Hutchinson residents whose homes were damaged, who were displaced by evacuations, or who suffered health effects. The family of the elderly couple killed filed a wrongful death lawsuit, perhaps the most emotionally charged legal action. Their relatives died because gas that should have remained safely stored underground had leaked into their home and exploded, all while technicians dismissed pressure warnings. The legal discovery process revealed damning details. Internal logs showed multiple technicians observed the pressure drop on January 14. Some questioned whether it might indicate a leak. But senior personnel determined pressure drop was consistent with gas cooling, and no investigation was needed. That decision, to categorize an unexplained pressure anomaly as routine without verification tests, was the critical failure. If investigators had checked well S1 on January 14 or 15, they likely would have discovered the leak. The facility could have been shut down, substantially reducing disaster severity. The question of why technicians made this critical misjudgment became central to understanding prevention. Investigation revealed a culture where anomalies were often explained away rather than thoroughly investigated. Pressure fluctuations, equipment glitches, measurement errors, there were always potential explanations that didn't require shutting down operations. This culture of normalization, treating anomalies as normal rather than warning signs, created an environment where serious problems could be overlooked until catastrophic. Regulatory oversight came under scrutiny. Yaggy operated under permits from Kansas Department of Health and Environment, but investigation revealed enforcement was minimal. Inspections were infrequent and often scheduled in advance, giving facility time to prepare. There was little verification that monitoring was actually being conducted as required. The regulatory agency had essentially trusted the operator to self-report problems. The settlements were substantial. Business owners received $5.25 million combined for property losses and business interruption. While significant, many argued it didn't truly compensate them for businesses built over generations. Money could rebuild structures but couldn't restore customer relationships or community presence. The class action lawsuit was settled for $5 million divided among hundreds of claimants. Individual payments ranged from a few $100s to tens of thousands. The wrongful death lawsuit was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount rumored to be several $1 million. Beyond financial compensation, lawsuits achieved another important goal: establishing a clear record of corporate negligence and regulatory failure. The legal proceedings documented in painful detail how bad decisions, inadequate oversight, and misplaced priorities created conditions for disaster. This record became the foundation for regulatory reforms intended to prevent similar incidents. Lawmakers in Kansas responded by pushing for stricter regulations on underground gas storage facilities throughout the state. New legislation required more frequent inspections by qualified third-party engineers who had no financial interest in keeping facilities operational. Monitoring requirements were strengthened with specific protocols for investigating any pressure anomalies that couldn't be immediately explained by normal operational factors. Facilities were required to develop and file comprehensive emergency response plans identifying potential risks, mapping all known abandoned wells in vicinity, and establishing clear procedures for shutting down operations if leaks were suspected. The legislation also imposed steeper penalties, including potential criminal charges for facility operators who ignored safety warnings or failed to report problems to regulators. These regulatory changes represented a fundamental shift in how underground storage was overseen. The old model had been premised on trust and self-regulation with minimal government intervention. The new model recognized that operators facing economic pressures couldn't always be trusted to prioritize safety over profit, and that active, skeptical regulatory oversight was essential to protect public safety. Other states with underground gas storage facilities watched Hutchinson closely, and many implemented similar reforms, using Kansas's painful experience to strengthen their own safety systems before disasters occurred. The Yaggy Storage Facility was shut down permanently in disaster aftermath. All remaining gas stored in underground caverns was carefully drawn down over several months and injected into other parts of gas distribution system. The wells were then properly sealed using techniques far more robust than the concrete plugs that had failed to contain gas when wells S1 was damaged. The facility site was decommissioned and land eventually sold, ending decades of gas storage operations at that location. Kansas Gas Service developed replacement storage capacity at other facilities with different geological characteristics, avoiding areas with numerous abandoned brine wells that could provide pathways for gas migration. For residents, recovery was long and difficult. The flaring operation continued for weeks, and even after all escaped gas had been burned off, many residents were hesitant to return to evacuated homes. Trust had been broken. People who had lived entire lives in Hutchinson without thinking twice about ground beneath their feet now viewed their cities underground with suspicion and fear. What other abandoned wells existed beneath their homes? What other potential pathways could allow gas or contaminants to reach surface? These questions nagged even after officials declared areas safe. Environmental remediation took years. Contaminated soil had to be excavated and properly disposed of at hazardous waste facilities. Groundwater monitoring continued for years afterward, testing wells throughout affected area to ensure hydrocarbon contamination wasn't spreading or persisting at dangerous levels. Some residential wells testing positive for contamination had to be permanently closed, and affected homeowners were connected to municipal water supply at significant expense. The full environmental legacy would persist for decades, a subsurface contamination plume that would take years to naturally degrade and disperse. The psychological impact on the community deserved recognition alongside physical and economic damage. A disaster where ground itself became an enemy and explosions could occur anywhere without warning created collective trauma affecting the entire community. Parents became hyper-vigilant about unusual smells or sounds that might indicate gas. Children who had been in school during evacuations developed anxiety about being separated from parents in emergencies. Workers in downtown buildings struggled with fear every time they went to basement storage areas. These psychological effects diminished with time but never completely disappeared for those who lived through January 2001. The disaster also highlighted hidden infrastructure beneath American cities and risks created when that infrastructure is poorly documented or maintained. Hutchinson was not unique in having numerous abandoned industrial wells beneath its streets. Thousands of American cities and towns, particularly in regions with historical mining or oil and gas activity, have similar networks of forgotten wells penetrating deep underground. Most were drilled before comprehensive record-keeping requirements existed. They were abandoned using whatever sealing techniques were considered acceptable at the time, standards that often wouldn't meet modern safety requirements. They create potential pathways for gas-contaminated groundwater or other substances to migrate from deep underground to surface. Hutchinson demonstrated that these forgotten wells represent a ticking time bomb beneath communities that may not even know the wells exist. Efforts to systematically locate and properly seal abandoned wells accelerated after Hutchinson. State geological surveys in Kansas and other states initiated programs to search historical mining and drilling records, identify known wells, then conduct field surveys to locate them physically and assess their condition. Wells found inadequately sealed were re-drilled and sealed using modern techniques. But the task was enormous. Estimates suggested Kansas alone might have thousands of abandoned wells from historical salt, oil and gas operations. Many had no records indicating location. Finding them required combining historical map research, aerial photography analysis, ground-penetrating radar surveys, and sometimes simply walking fields looking for depressions or other surface features that might indicate well location. 20 years after disaster, Hutchinson had recovered physically but remained marked by the experience. The empty lots downtown where Decor Shop and Woody's Appliance once stood remained undeveloped, serving as informal memorials. The mobile home park site had been cleared and returned to open land. Most residents who had been displaced had either returned or resettled elsewhere, though some families never fully recovered financially from disruption. The flare sites where gas had been burned off for weeks had been reclaimed and showed little evidence of what occurred there. But the disaster remained part of communities' collective memory and identity. People who had been children during evacuations now told their own children's stories about the time when ground itself seemed to turn against Hutchinson. The Hutchinson gas explosions stand as a reminder that in an industrialized society built atop a century and a half of resource extraction and processing, the ground beneath our feet contains hidden histories and hidden dangers. The infrastructure of the past, abandoned wells, depleted mines, buried pipelines, forgotten waste sites, doesn't simply disappear. It remains underground, aging, corroding, often completely forgotten by current residents but still capable of creating catastrophe when modern activities intersect with these historical remnants. The 6 people who died in January 2001 died because natural gas from a modern storage facility found pathways through wells drilled in the 1800s, and because technicians dismissed pressure warnings as too minor to investigate thoroughly. Their deaths illustrated that disasters often emerge from the intersection of past and present, from old infrastructure meeting new operations, and from organizational cultures that normalize warning signs until those signs become catastrophes that can no longer be ignored.